Welcome to Facts for Real Videos. Myanmar's capital city is Naypyidaw. 50 million people live in this heavily forested nation in Southeast Asia. You might recall that video. We discussed a topic that nearly attracted as many views as the population of Myanmar today. If you were alive before 1989, you may be familiar with the nation by a different name. Before a military dictatorship made its way into power in the 1960s, Myanmar was known as Burma. This is actually quite contentious because many people didn't think this regime had the right to change the name of the country. However, the nation is referred to as Myanmar by the UN, thus that's the name. But totally devoid of automobiles, parks and gardens are the same, as are malls. The occasional truck may roll past, but it will typically have the entire road to itself. The main distinction between Naypyidaw and a post-apocalyptic city is that while there are dozens of opulent luxury hotels, the pools are empty and most of the rooms have never even been used. And there is an airport with space for several million passengers. But on a busy day, there are rarely more than a few hundred people. The only people you're likely to see are gardeners and street cleaners. An army of workers keeps the capital in immaculate condition, and there are workers in the stores as well. In 2015, two journalists from The Guardian visited the city and reported seeing dozens of people working in a jewelry store, but no customers. There is little doubt that since 2015, the population has somewhat increased. With fewer than 400,000 residents back then, Naypyidaw was even more of a ghost city, yet it's still unsettling to consider, and this capital keeps getting crazier. Two journalists from The Guardian visited the city and reported seeing dozens of people working in a jewelry store, but no customers. There is little doubt that since 2015, the population has somewhat increased. With fewer than 400,000 residents back then, Naypyidaw was even more of a ghost city, yet it's still unsettling to consider. And this capital keeps getting crazier. There's another location where you might run into some folks. The huge complex of ostentatious, identical-looking buildings encircled by moats and walls is home to Myanmar's parliament. There are soldiers stationed all around this compound, making it difficult to approach. But when no one else is nearby, who are they really supposed to stop? It's nearly impossible to verify the reports that these high-security structures are connected to an underground tube system that runs beneath the city and was allegedly developed with assistance from North Korean technicians. However, given how peculiar Naypyidaw is, this ministerial zone shouldn't really come as a huge surprise. There is a military zone within the city. The roofs of the buildings in the residential zone are color-coded based on the occupations of the residents, and there are multiple residential zones in addition to a hotel zone. The Ministry of Health's employees have blue roofs, while the Ministry of Agriculture's employees have green roofs. Naturally, the majority of residences in these enormous, ungainly city zones are unoccupied, lacking any sort of rational structure or order. And there are multiple residential zones in addition to a hotel zone. The Ministry of Health's employees have blue roofs, while the Ministry of Agriculture's employees have green roofs. Naturally, the majority of residences in these enormous, ungainly city zones are unoccupied, lacking any sort of rational structure or order. There is no city core in Naypyidaw. Instead, it appears as though the various areas of the city have been thrown together carelessly. The roads are also poorly planned, making it difficult to maneuver and feels like one is traveling through a random maze. If there were indeed 20 lanes of traffic here, have a look at this 20-lane roadway inside the ministry zone that sometimes links to a much smaller route. It would cause gridlock right away. There is just no logic to the planning. There are certain roundabouts that are so enormous and strange that just looking at them causes mental pain. It is fortunate that there aren't any automobiles on these roads because you won't find roundabouts like this anyplace else in the world. There would be traffic on these roundabouts for sure. This one is especially odd since it is situated in the middle of a 16-lane highway, but for some reason, the decision was made to construct a different route that would circumvent the roundabout and then intersect the highway at a 90-degree angle. I'm not familiar with you. Yet it doesn't seem like a smart idea to me to do a 90-degree turn on a 16-lane highway. Another enormous 16-lane highway is to the east, like an airline runway as it stretches for kilometers in an almost perfect straight line from the air. Naturally, this might just be a coincidence. Yet oddly enough, it's also situated between a military zone and a base. Some of these roads are quite hazardous to travel on. The Death Highway is a section of road that runs south from Naypyidaw. Since the road's opening in 2010, numerous deadly collisions have occurred on it. It's also situated between a military zone and a base. Some of these roads are quite hazardous to travel on. The Death Highway is a section of road that runs south from Naypyidaw. Since the road's opening in 2010, Numerous deadly collisions have occurred on it. There is a well-known sign beside the death highway that is strangely written in English. It is either a warning or a grim joke for some drivers, as it may be their last sight before they crash. Other oddities near Naypyidaw include the striking Upa Tasanti Pagoda. This is really just a copy of a structure in the former capital of Yangon. The pagoda is supposed to be a Buddhist monument, but when it was first constructed, politicians and military officials were the only ones permitted to approach it. This is the capital of Myanmar. Something doesn't seem right, and this begs the question of why the Naypyidaw was constructed in the first place. Years ago by the same contentious military regime that, in the 1960s, violently and extremely unpopularly changed the name of Burma to Myanmar, and by controversial we mean that students at Yangon University staged a protest after the regime overthrew them in a military coup. In response, the regime dispatched a battalion of soldiers. The number of casualties is unknown, but hundreds of students were shot. They also refused to organize elections, at least not until 1990. This is the kind of regime we have here, a brutal, violent dictatorship. These people are also the ones who ordered the construction of Naypyidaw. The exact start date of the construction is a military secret, but satellite images indicate that it may have begun in 2002. Even then, the election was meaningless when the military only won 10 of the 492 seats available. They cancelled the election and arrested opposition politicians. 3 years later the city was unveiled under the name Naypyidaw, which roughly translates as Home of Kings. It is clear that these military leaders felt confident in their own worth. The city cost $4 billion to build, which may not seem like much for a city this size but is still a significant amount of money for a nation whose GDP at the time was less than $10 billion US. There were undoubtedly better ways to spend that money. Parts of Myanmar are impoverished and lack access to healthcare and education, but the military regime really didn't seem to care. It wasn't simply a lot of money. To make matters worse, the metropolis had transformed into an odd, ghostly megacity. When you view these pictures, it seems like a waste of money, but what if the government had intended a ghostly megacity? To make matters worse, the metropolis had transformed into an odd, ghostly megacity. When you view these pictures, it seems like a waste of money, but what if the government had intended a ghostly megacity? If you thought this story was strange already, it's about to get even stranger. Before Naypyidaw, the capital of Myanmar was a coastal city called Yangon. Home to over 7 million people, Yangon was named the national capital when Myanmar was a part of the British Empire in 1852. More than 150 years later, the dictatorship in Myanmar decided Yangon was no longer suitable for its intended use, citing the simple fact that the city's population was outgrowing it. Although many people don't realize it, the real reason the military developed Naypyidaw is much stranger than the official one. The regime wanted to rebuild its infrastructure in a brand new city with greater room and better urban planning. The majority of scholars believe that the government was wary of Yangon's rapidly expanding population because it believed it would be difficult to put down a large-scale uprising involving so many civilians at once. The government was also aware of other forms of protest, such as those organized by students at Yangon University. They handled, and it seemed only a matter of time until one of these protests turned into something more significant. It was also reported that the regime was concerned about an unlikely U.S. naval attack from the Bay of Bengal. While it is unlikely, the U.S. government did not approve of the dictatorship and continued to refer to the nation as Burma in official documents rather than adopting the new name, Myanmar. Since they had previously engaged in Southeast Asia, most notably in Vietnam, the military government chose to relocate the capital city to this peaceful inland area. It would be much more difficult for the U.S. to strike and far less susceptible to public demonstrations. They strategically placed their city between the Bago Yoma and Shan Yoma mountain chains, which created natural defensive barriers deep within the city. They also constructed the heavily guarded government complex, complete with soldiers, fences, and some sort of moat or river. Not to mention those underground tunnels. It's also possible that they purposefully left the rest of the city largely deserted, meaning that there was less chance of a popular uprising endangering the regime's position. Fences, and some sort of moat or river. Not to mention those underground tunnels. It's also possible that they purposefully left the rest of the city largely deserted, meaning that there was less chance of a popular uprising endangering the regime's position. Wide roads would make it easy for the army to defend against any protests, even if the population has been slowly increasing over time. Some people even believe that the 20-lane highways are secret military runways, where a plane could land in different parts of the city prepared to defend against violent protests in a way that would never have been possible on Yangon's narrow streets. The theories don't end there. Perhaps the city is laid out in such a confusing way to make it more difficult for protesters to find their way around, or that the streets are kept immaculate to make it more difficult for demonstrators to erect barricades. Since the entire city isn't actually a city, even the death highway that runs between Yangon and Naypyidaw may be a purposeful defensive strategy. Just to be clear, the military junta in Myanmar has never verified any of this. It's a sizable military fortress. Perhaps they moved for administrative reasons to avoid the traffic in Yangon's congested streets, as the official explanation claims. However, a bizarre city like this one can't have such a straightforward explanation, can it? Yes, the government decided to organize new democratic elections in 2015. Even though it was another loss. They gave the election results some thought, and for a while, things in Myanmar appeared to be improving, but that changed in 2021. Following the military's second coup attempt to seize power and plunge the nation into chaos, a civil war between the two factions has been raging ever since. However, the focal point of this conflict is Yangon, the nation's most populous city, where protests and battles are being fought. Meanwhile, Nebula sits empty and unperturbed in the middle of the country, with military leaders tucked away safe from all the action. A coincidence perhaps, or a fortress, right in the middle. Thank you for viewing, and we'll see you in the next video. Tell us why you believe this city was formed in the comments section below, where protests and battles are being fought. Meanwhile, Nebula sits empty and unperturbed in the middle of the country, with military leaders tucked away safe from all the action. A coincidence perhaps, or a fortress, right in the middle. Thank you for viewing, and we'll see you in the next video. Tell us why you believe this city was formed in the comments section below.